pleasure to be with you today and present the 2024 cybersecurity report. And it's my pleasure to be today here with my esteemed colleague, Shira. So Shira, welcome.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Good to be here with you.
And first of all, before we jump right into it, I would like to say thank you so much to the audience. Guess what? We are totally sold out. More than 1,000 registrants, no seat left. Again, it's huge, and we are really overwhelmed by the resonance. And we know in the past, many of you have reached out asking, when is the next report going to be published? So here we are. This is a sneak preview on what will be published on February 7th, and you're here to listen what we have to say in that report. So stay tuned, and we jump right into it. Okay, so what can you expect from this year's report? Other than last year's report, or I should say the previous reports, where we collected the data to present the state of automotive cybersecurity, this year we totally changed the approach. And as you can see from the agenda here, we'll introduce some unique and new perspective. So it's not a refresh of data points that we had in the past. We are taking on a new perspective with new data sets, looking at threat actors, looking at deep and dark web, looking at financial impact, SBOM. GenAI cannot be missed on these type of reports. And as you're familiar with in previous reports also, we'd like to shed some light on what we believe is going to happen in 2024 and beyond. So as you can see on the shelf on this slide, we have added the new reports to the family of reports that we have done in the past. And again, thank you so much for reaching out, encouraging, and finding the information that we published so insightful, helpful to move forward in our industry, which we really care about, and move cybersecurity forward and making our streets more secure and safe. So with that, I would say, Shira, why don't we do a little bit of a recap where we left off with the report in 2023. Can you walk us about what was the state of automotive cybersecurity in smart mobility in 2023?
Sure, Giuseppe, absolutely. So just to remind everybody what we talked about last year, it was all about the expansion of the automotive industry into this vast smart mobility ecosystem. And with that, the cybersecurity landscape is dramatically changing. If you remember the slide from last year, let me just point out a few interesting numbers, and some of them will be interesting for what's coming next in this session. So if we're looking about how the industry is expanding with the addition of more and more applications, software-defined elements within the vehicle and its surrounding, then the cloud is becoming fundamental in operating the vehicle, but also protecting the vehicle. And we saw last year 35% of incidents were related directly to the cloud and telematics systems. Keep that number in mind. 8% of incidents were related to infotainment systems. And again, this is showing how the industry is evolving, and keep that number in mind as well. And last year, we focused on two specific numbers. The 12% representing API-related attacks. This was the first time we saw a significant number of attacks targeting APIs and mobility-related applications. Just the year before, it was a 2%. So last year, we saw a nearly 400% increase of API-related attacks. And for the first time last year, we saw incidents related to EV charging infrastructure, which accounted for 4%. So as the industry is evolving, we're seeing new trends, and cybersecurity processes and strategies are dramatically evolving. And let's jump into what we saw this year. Okay, so just to get us started, as Giuseppe indicated, we're going to focus on the inflection point. And when we think about the inflection point, we're focusing on a big change, right? So before we jump into the change, Giuseppe, let's look at the basic numbers. How many incidents did we have this year?
Yes, and I think this graphic is very familiar to our audience. We have published this type of data in the past reports as well. As you can imagine and expect, cyber is still top of mind, so numbers are growing, and we see in 2023 now 295, significantly up, and also the total incidents in the last 13 years is also a number that has gone dramatically up. So this is a chart that I would say is the expected and is keeping up with the tradition of what we showed in the past. Now, if we continue on the next slide, which is also somewhat familiar in terms of the data that we present here, is as you can see, we have still this shift between the majority of attackers coming from the black hat side versus the white hats. There hasn't been a significant change in that. So last year we reported 63%, but it was the first year last time where the majority of attackers were black hat. What is remarkable, though, this time is that if you look at the long-range attack, it went up from 70%. So now we are at 85%. And again, as you can expect, if devices, IoT devices like complex connected autonomous vehicle are, the moment they're connected, this is the exposure to being connected to the internet. Therefore, long-range attacks, we will see growing that numbers in the years to come, probably. And I believe that now it's time, Shira, to talk about the inflection point. So what does the inflection point mean? Why so critical? Why so important? And why is the perfect storm that everyone was waiting for and talking about, why do we believe it's now?
So it was interesting, Giuseppe, that you mentioned it, because as we're thinking about the industry over the last few months and trying to understand what's really going on, we figured out that counting the number of incidents is important, but we felt that we were missing something. And it was time for us, as we saw more and more attacks going after telematics, more attacks going after infotainments, more attacks going after APIs, we figured out that we may have been missing something, and we have to start looking at the impact. So it's not enough to count the incidents. We need to figure out what they're actually causing and the damage that they could be potentially inflicting. And what we did, before we look at 2023, we went back to 2021 and 2022, and we analyzed all the incidents that were related to automotive and smart mobility, as we do every year. But this time, we analyzed the potential impact. Now, you'll hear me talking about potential quite often, because to be honest, we don't know for sure what was the actual impact. We know that our analysts went back, looked at the data, and they have an estimation, right? So we have to be honest and say none of this is 100% sure, but it's our best estimate. And when we looked at those incidents that were reported, keep the deep and dark web aside for a minute, we saw something quite stable, right? In both years, we saw that about 1 or 2% at the bottom of incidents had the potential to impact millions of mobility assets. By the way, when we talk about mobility assets, it could be vehicles, but it could also be applications, companion apps. It could be EV charging stations or infrastructure. So there's a lot of elements that are related to our industry. So 1 or 2% had the dramatic potential of impacting millions. About 20% had the potential to impact thousands of mobility assets. And about 80% of incidents in total had the potential to impact a few hundreds, a few dozens of mobility assets. And really, it sounds like we're discounting it, right? But when it comes to safety, even 1 is really bad, but it's not dramatic. So this is what happened in 2021. Now, here's the time to fasten your seatbelt and let's see what happened this year. The numbers have completely changed. And when we analyze incidents reported in the clear web and looked at the potential impact, nearly 50% of incidents had the potential to inflict damage on thousands to millions of assets. If you just look at the massive, those are the really dramatic incidents, we more than doubled from 2% to 5%. High impact has doubled from 20-ish to almost 45%. And this is the real inflection point, right? This is the hockey stick, or that moment in time where we see the actual impact. And as we progress throughout this session, we'll show you different elements of this scale and the impact that it could inflict. Before we jump in, I wanted to give you one example of one incident. And on purpose, we didn't choose an automaker. We chose a fleet system vendor to, again, highlight that this is not only relevant to automakers. They're not the only ones responsible. There are many other stakeholders that are sharing the responsibility. And in this incident, it was reported in early September. And this is an American vendor of a fleet management system that performs two elements. The first one, it enables the drivers to log their hours. This is very important for regulations and compliance in America. And the second element that this vendor provides is inventory management for the fleet. Obviously, both of these elements and technologies are instrumental for business operations. And due to a ransom attack, which we estimate could have been resulted with APIs, but we're not 100% sure because it wasn't reported. It's just an estimation. These systems were essentially, they became unavailable on a large percentage of the fleet. Okay, so this is exactly one of these examples. And according to what we saw drivers report, it took approximately 3 weeks for the vendor to recover from this ransomware attack. Okay, so in this case, we're estimating thousands of commercial vehicles, trucks mostly, that were impacted in their ability to operate in the way that they were designed. So this is just one example of a highly interesting incident that happened recently. Giuseppe, how do you see this scale reflect in the different attack vectors that we examine on a regular basis?
Yeah, rightly said, Shira. So when we look now at the different attack vector category, if you will, you see here that there are two very prominent areas where we have seen and reported attacks. So one is the telematics and cloud, and the other is the infotainment. What is interesting to note is that almost 60% combined between telematics and cloud had a significant rise in the number of events. So telematics and cloud up from 35 to 43, and the infotainment almost doubled. So I think this is a different approach and areas where the focus of the threat actors are currently in the industry. And if we summarize now the first part, Shira, and do a recap of, okay, what is the impact? To summarize the first section of this presentation is, keep in mind, 95% of 2023 incidents were remote, 85% were long range. So as I mentioned earlier, it's growing, and bad things are done remotely. 64% of the incidents were performed by black hats. We see that as a constant, slightly rising number. And last but not least, the takeaway of this section is that 50% of the 2023 incidents had the potential to massively impact thousands, or if not millions of vehicles. And that's why the title says from initial tampering, if you will, to massive large-scale attack potential. All right.
Fantastic. So now that we covered what's going on in the clear web, this is time to see what's hiding underneath the hood. And this year, for the first time, we've decided to not just look at what's reported in the clear web, but rather what are threat actors doing in the deep and dark web. And this is extremely important for the different stakeholders to be not just reactive to incidents, but be proactive and understand what's really about to happen in the future. And before we go into the numbers, let's explain what we actually did here. So at Upstream, we have a team of automotive cybersecurity analysts, a team called AutoThreat. And throughout this year, they have researched the 300 most active threat actors that are specifically targeting our ecosystem. And to understand who these folks are, some of them are people, some of them are entities, companies, or teams of researchers and other folks. You can see two numbers that are interesting. About 26% are actual black hats, right? Those are folks that we identify as having malicious intents. The white hats, you guys know, these are the researchers that we count on to push us to our boundaries. And then 19% are fraud operators. It's a little bit difficult to categorize those guys because sometimes it's hard to know what exactly they're after. But in general, what we can say is that they do have malicious intent, but they're targeting their own assets, right? They're there to make money or save money. So these are the two groups that I want you to keep in mind. We'll get to them in a minute. So out of those 300 people and actors, we wanted to see what are they talking about? Where does scale come to life in their activities? Keep in mind that these are the most active right now. So this is more of a snapshot, less of a trend analysis. And very similar to the analysis that we did for the clear web, we tried to assess the potential impact of the vulnerabilities and other chatter that they're discussing. And if you remember in the clear web, we talked about approximately 50% of incidents having the potential to impact thousands to millions. Well, in the deep and dark web, the numbers look different. Now we are at 65% of actors talking about potential vulnerabilities that have the impact on thousands and millions of assets. So this is a big change, right, as what we would have expected. And if you look at massive, we're at 5% of total threat actors. This number is about to change as we dive into the more malicious intent. So we found this number not a big surprise, but extremely important as we try to help protect. Now, as we analyze these 300 threat actors, we wanted to see who are they targeting. And let's actually start from the top. At those 52% that you see, these are threat actors that are targeting a specific OEM or stakeholder. So they're talking about the ability of inflicting damage or finding vulnerabilities that are only relevant to one stakeholder. But the rest, they're going after scale. And now we're tying all the dots again, right? So 11% of threat actors, we're talking about potential damage or cyber security attacks against several OEMs or stakeholders. And 37%, we're talking about potentially damaging multiple stakeholders on a global scale. So overall, we're seeing how scale is reflected also in that perspective. And now, let's focus more on the really bad guys, right? Those who have real malicious intents. And out of the 300 threat actors that we've categorized and researched over the last few months, about 45%, so 135, are categorized as black hats or fraud operators. And this is the number that we're seeing in terms of the scale. So overall, in total, they're up to par, almost, with the other community of threat actors. But look at the bottom number. If we analyze only the potential to impact millions of assets, this number grows by 1.6 compared to the general threat actor community. So when it comes to malicious intent, they are, for obvious reasons, are going after vulnerabilities that have the potential of impacting millions of vehicles or applications or assets. And that is a number that we need to keep in mind. When it comes to the global reach, we're also seeing a shift towards scale, right? So if the total number for threat actors was 37% of chatter relating to global scale, when it comes to the malicious actors, we are up to 48% of chatter in the deep and dark web that relates to global multiple stakeholders. So this is how we see the scale reflecting. And just to sum it up from the deep and dark web perspective, we also wanted to share with you a little bit of information about what they're actually talking about. And there are two numbers here that I find specifically interesting. As you can, expect, 50% of the chatter goes directly into vulnerability exploits, how to actually perform attacks. But I actually want you to look at the 12% of PII. And, everybody's talking about how data is the new gold or the new oil. And obviously, we couldn't agree more. But as we think about software-defined vehicles and connected vehicles, and vehicles today and mobility assets in general generate so much data, all stored in the cloud, this data is extremely valuable. It holds a financial gain for different threat actors, not to mention the malicious ones, and they're going after this data. And we'll see that reflected as we go into the financial impact analysis in a minute. And Giuseppe, I want to hand it back to you to speak a little bit about this financial impact and what does this mean?
Yeah, absolutely, sure. Now, so far, maybe just do a quick recap. We talked about scale. We talked about what is the motivation and who are the bad guys. And now if we look and move towards, okay, what does it actually mean? So inflection, not about the magnitude, but also trying to weigh in and understand the magnitude in terms of financial numbers. It's really hard, as you said, to attach definitive number because we are talking here about deep and dark web. Even the publicly reported information is not always such that you would immediately be able to allocate a number to it. Now, what we have done in Upstream, and this is, by the way, a way how we work with our auto threat customers to create a framework by which we can slice and dice the impact and the financial impact in particular to different categories. And you see here on the right-hand side, vehicle safety and operations, one dimension. Data and privacy, as you mentioned, is a very important way to look at data. Vehicle theft, service and business, etc., etc. And the way we look at it is also by assessing, okay, what are dimensions that really give us a hint about the magnitude. And as an example, on the left-hand side, we show here one of the biggest, if not the biggest, ransomware attack in history, which was in June 2023. So a Taiwanese Tier 2 was hit by a ransomware demand of 70 million. So that's massive. That's really a lot of money that is at stake. And therefore, looking at financials, even beyond the magnitude and what is the possible and the impact is exactly what we wanted to shed some light today. And moving on to the next slide, I'm sure you have more examples that we want to share with the audience here.
Right. Thanks, Giuseppe. So we took this framework that you just described, and we try to give you guys an estimation of what does this actually mean. Now, when we talk about a financial framework, it's important to say that this analysis will be performed differently by different stakeholders, depending on their priorities, but it's also quite subjective, right, as we analyze this. So the point here is not to give you a definitive number. It's not a price tag, right? But more of a thought process that we encourage all of you to perform in your roles so they can better analyze the financial impact of these cyber attacks. So we're going to use two examples. The first one is a vulnerability that was described in March of 2023. You can see here the quote from TechCrunch. And in this case, it was a large EV OEM that as a part of their bounty program, they found a significant vulnerability in the gateway energy management system. Now, the researchers showed how they could perform basic commands remotely on the vehicles. So they could blow the horn and take the windows down and play with the engine and do all sorts of stuff. But the researchers also claimed that had they been given a few more minutes, they could have potentially gained full access to the vehicle. And this is something that we haven't seen for a long time, right? If we remember Charlie Miller. But this is something that we've been talking about in the industry for the last few years. And here's a live example of how it could have happened. But we're going to analyze it from a more conservative perspective. So just to sum it up, what we're going to look at, so the severity is certainly high. In this case, the actor type is a white hat. The potential impact is fleet-wide. In this case, we're talking about a fleet that is over 3 million vehicles. Now, let's look at the numbers. What we've chosen to do is only analyze 3 items from the framework that Giuseppe described. We wanted to talk about OTAs, a potential for a battery recall, and a potential for a class action. Now, it is important to say all these numbers are estimates, right? We're basing them on objective numbers in analysis, but these are our estimates. So let's talk about OTA updates. The specific TechCrunch article mentioned that the OEM claimed that the vulnerability could have been patched by an over-the-air update. So how much does that cost? Certainly not for free. And we found a fascinating model by Aurora Labs that estimates how much it will cost to push a chunk of code into a fleet of vehicles. And if we try to analyze what that size of code would be, we're at approximately $1 to $2 million of a cost to patch this vulnerability. All right, that starts to get interesting. But the big numbers are coming right up. The articles on TechCrunch mentioned that there was a potential for this vulnerability to result in a battery dysfunction, right? In that case, the OEM would have no other choice but to declare a recall on the batteries. We know that batteries are probably one of the most, if not the most expensive component in electric vehicles. There are estimates north of $15,000, but we wanted to take a conservative number. And you can see in the assumptions that we assumed that only up to 0.5% of the fleet would get impacted, right? We can imagine what would have been the result should the entire fleet or a big portion of the fleet been impacted. But if we only take 0.5%, we are at north of $26 million of the cost of the recall. And that's just taking into account the $15,000. We're not taking into account anything else like trust or safety. And we can expect that should something like this happen, a class action would follow immediately. And if we look at the number of plaintiffs and we assume that only 1% of the vehicle owners of this OEM would join this class action, and we've seen indications of averages of $600 per plaintiff, this is another $20 million add. So in this specific case, this incident could easily cost the OEM anywhere between $20 and $50 million. This is quite dramatic. Now, let's take a completely different example, this time from the EV charging space. And in June of 2023, again, TechCrunch reported a real incident that, remember we talked a lot about data? So here we go. Here's a live example of a data breach. And in this case, a global EV charging network suffered a ransom demand on their data. And the data breach was at approximately 1 terabyte. So this is quite dramatic. In terms of the type of data that was leaked, we're talking about charging point location, VIN numbers. Just think about how much value VIN numbers would have in the deeper dark web, consumer PII, and a lot more that was leaked. If we want to summarize this incident, it was certainly high severity. This time it's a black hat, not a white hat. And we're talking about a charging network of a few thousands, hundreds of thousands of charging stations in over 30 countries worldwide. And in this case, we wanted to look at completely different elements of the framework that Giuseppe mentioned. We wanted to look at the cost of a data breach. Now, there is a fascinating analysis by IBM that looks into the cost of a data breach. And when we talk about lower scales of data, they can really show you how much each log will cost you should you have this data leaked. But when it comes to this magnitude, they go to just talk about lump sums. And the averages that we see at a data breach at this magnitude, we are at anywhere between $30 and $40 million of costs. If we add, now it sounds small, but if we just look at GDPR, and because this is a global network, then GDPR finds either the averages for the transportation sector or the averages for insufficient measures. This is, again, another $1 to $2 million. So when it comes to data, what we can see is that the cost of a data breach can go anywhere between $30 and $40 million in our ecosystem. And this is quite dramatic for many stakeholders. And this is, we wanted to give you a taste of the financial impact. And Giuseppe, we talked a lot about what we call the external impact, right? How does the stakeholder be perceived, or the damage that they're dealing with externally? But can you walk us a little bit about the internal implications of the changing cybersecurity landscape?
Yes, definitely, Shira. So what we see in the day-to-day activities with our clients, prospects, also partners, etc., is that the concept of a dynamic SBOM has become top of mind. And actually, Upstream started to talk about this almost a year ago, where we introduced the concept of orchestration. And we'll talk about that in a minute again. But what we see in the conversation, also in discussion, but also, as you mentioned, in this very broad ecosystem, when we speak about the vehicle and its surrounding ecosystem, it's fair to say that mobility is not just a product, it's not just a vehicle, and therefore software is everywhere. Just alone, I recently read a report where saying that by 2035, we'll have 600 million lines of code, if not more, in a bit modern vehicle. So if you extend that to the adjacent ecosystem, charging station, applications, over-the-air updates, so software-related assets, this is massive, and we see that in the discussion with involved parties, that if you add to the complexity of that ecosystem also the regulatory side, which we know is we're in the middle of it with the UNSCE WB29 R155/56. We know in China is coming up. We have different type of approaches with NHTSA. At the end of the day, what this means is that we really need to have a dynamic way of managing and mitigating risk. So risk management by combining the world of development and the world of operations. Now, if we look a step forward to the next slide, actually, what it means is that the evolution of a concept which is dynamic, so going from a static approach into something that is dynamic, it's taking into account that in order to do proper risk management and mitigation, we need vulnerability management capabilities, we need cyber threat intelligence capability to fuel this as part of an incident response framework for the VSOCs. And therefore, cyber threat intelligence is very popular, even beyond the pure vulnerability management, where it's critical to proactively really identify those threats. So our contribution into that is to inform with the data that we have collected that where threat actors are active, who they are, because we collect them and we have information about their specific taste or preferences. So being proactive about that is really key. And we see that discussion with customer prospects and interested party in this domain, continuously assessing and manage supply chain risk way beyond the pure vulnerability is becoming more and more critical. And also the ability to very quickly detect cybersecurity risks, even before it's recognized as such. So even the chatter that you mentioned is something that is relevant because one of the biggest challenge if you have an incident, if we see an incident, is how much time does it take to fix it? So the more time we can buy by anticipating and understanding what is at risk, is effective time used in order to mitigate those risks. And if you look at the next slide, this is the concept that we had introduced mid of last year. It's essentially thinking of the mitigation process as part of, now we have put here CSMS and SUMS, so the UNSCE regulation, but despite the framework that we're using, despite if it's a regulatory necessity or not, we see that our customers start to rethink the tool chain, meaning what has worked for over 100 years is questioned, or at least it's looked into to understand how we can get from this very famous V model where you have verification, validation, and then you have servicing in the past. Today, it's becoming critical more than ever to have the proper way to connect the dots between operations, the real world attacks, which you can never plan and anticipate for as things are researched and developed. And one of the connection points that we see, and this is a broad discussion, is the threat and risk analysis. So the very static way which today this is done, if we have software-defined vehicle where by, I don't know, every minute you technically can change and alter totally the functionality and state of a product, of a vehicle, of an asset, it's important to have the ability to very dynamically also adjust and take care and take into account the risks that come with the new version, new software that has been uploaded. And I think this is really critical as we move forward. And now taking this to the next level. So, and we talked about this also in various occasions. The conversation about automating and whether GenAI is something that is relevant or not, or whether it's your friend or foe, if you will, is really, really important here. And obviously, we advocate that this is helpful, mostly because, and you can show this on the next slide, mostly because we believe that the bad guys, no matter what, they will use generative AI capabilities. So it's nothing that we can really avoid. And so it's an arms race where we need to fight with very similar tactics, techniques, and methodologies in order to respond adequately. We're still in the infancy, although we have been a few years now in automotive cybersecurity down the road in the industry. It's still a process whereby, on one hand, we have compliance. On the other hand, we have a lot of security challenges, as we have pointed out, which need to be addressed. And the magnitude of data, millions of assets, is something that is really hard to handle if we do not introduce generative AI capabilities by which we can really leverage and ask questions probably that we were not able to spot or find or hunt in the data that we have today. So therefore, it's really important to be able to have a bigger degree of automating things. And as you put here on the next slide, we started talking about the VSOC 3.0, which means let's take an approach which is agile in investigating. It needs to be agile because of the nature of the changing environment, so software updates, etc. The changing nature of the smart mobility assets. We need to account that this is nothing that can be handled manually at the end of the day. So having techniques in order to evolve into a generative AI-led perspective and VSOC capability is something that is really critical. And this is also something that we see as being heavily discussed in the industry, and it suggests that we will move this forward and be able to have a higher quality, taking to the next level. I'm sure we'll be soon talking about VSOC 4.0, so I will take that for a secret what that is. But for the time being, the transformation of the VSOC needs to go on because, as we have seen, the attackers are not stopping. The contrary, we need to be prepared more than ever to move it forward.
You know, Giuseppe, it's interesting because we started this conversation talking about the inflection point, right? And how the automotive cybersecurity landscape is changing dramatically, talking about scale. And to be honest, for some, it's a little bit scary, or what does this even mean? But it's interesting to see how it all sums up into GenAI that comes to support us and ensuring that VSOC 3.0 is not just equipped to handle massive scale attacks, traumatic impact attacks, and GenAI can really help. So it's great to see how technology is not just flowing behind us, but also really supporting us as we move forward in combating these rising scale of attacks. And as we try to wrap up this webinar, Giuseppe, I really want to hear from you. How do you see 2024 evolving from all your experience?
Yeah, I think there are four major items that we can discuss about. So there's probably more, but I would say the most important ones are the ones that we see here. So one is the digital transformation will continue. There's no way that we will see lesser attacks. It will continue to grow, no doubt about it. So as we have said multiple times, so software is eating the world, and APIs, as we put here, is eating software, and this is something that we need to account for. This is where the big money is ultimately, and that will continue to grow. The next, we already touched upon generative AI. So at the end, it's really important to be able to orchestrate. Organizations really need to make sure that the VSOC is the powerhouse, is the mission control empowered, because it is important not only from a technical perspective, but also from a business perspective. So the bottom line is affected if a services cannot be used, if there's a brand reputation involved, and therefore generative AI can certainly help speed up things because it's fundamental to be able to automate in the future and combat with equal arms the bad threat actors. The third one is, regulation and compliance is everywhere. If you look at the landscape today in automotive, it's really challenging. In fact, we call it regulatory fatigue, because sometimes it's even contradicting. So you may have a regulation which mandates one thing, and at the same time, if you stick to that, it's non-compliant for other regulations. And also, it's not just for the mobility or for the vehicle specific, like the UNSCE regulation, etc. There are other Cyber Resilience Act and other regulatory frameworks which makes it really hard to know exactly what to do. So this landscape is probably going to increase. We see this already, where you have single countries who are issuing regulation for charging station, like in the UK, and we don't have that as a commonly adopted standard framework in other countries, but eventually it will move there. And last but not least, EVs is poised to grow. There's no doubt about it. So this will be the future of mobility, and the charging infrastructure, everything that is related to IoT devices, so the charging station, the vehicle, the mobility apps, everything is relevant, and therefore the cyber risks. We are simply increasing the threat and attack surface, and this is something that we need to take into account as we move forward in 2024 and beyond. I think we are at the end, Shira, of this sneak preview, if you will. So this teaser of what is remind me, more than 150 pages long report that is about to be published. So
yes,
I would like to thank you, first of all, for being my companion here today and discussing some of the highlights of the report. As you can see here, if you take the QR code and you want to sign up for early access, you'll get the reports before the February 7 official publish date. So you may want to right now take your smartphone and scan the QR code. Other than that, big thank you to the entire Upstream team. I know how much effort goes into making this report available, the passion that people put into producing this. So this has been a very special webinar for us. Again, thank you to the audience, because it's such an amazing experience that people are really reaching out and want to learn about what is the next thing. In fact, we started to do mid-year reports exactly because of that. And I think now we are ready to take some questions, right?
Absolutely.